What's up YouTube, Capital G here, giving you guys a little mini guide to dealing with Pendulum Magicians. Pendulum Magicians are probably going to be one of the stronger decks in the entire meta, and I think that these are just some cards that can definitely help you out in that matchup, whether you're playing Pendulum Magicians yourself or if you're playing a rogue deck. A lot of these cards are incredibly helpful, and I think that we can all acknowledge that Pendulum Magicians not only got a huge boost in power thanks to Heavy Metaphors Electromite, but they're probably going to be an extremely popular deck. Whether you believe they're going to be first, second, I think only time will tell. YCS Atlanta will probably be the determining factor as to what people use to, kind of judge this deck and how good it ultimately is. But the power of the deck cannot be questioned, and even if it ultimately ends up being like the third best deck in the format, as long as we're not in a tier 0 format, then the third best deck in the format is still something you have to pay attention to. It's something where you're going to at least want to side deck for. So a lot of people might not know some of the best cards that beat Pendulum Magician. Some of these you might know about, some of these you might not, and I've actually categorized this into 3 different categories, and I picked some really good cards in each one. So let's go ahead and start breaking it down. The first category I have is spot removal, and the first card I'd like to talk about is Unending Nightmare. Unending Nightmare should be fairly obvious. I think that most people know that you're going to be targeting your opponent's Pendulum Scales with this card. Not just that, but it actually doubles as something that can out their Pendulum Graph cards, whether it be the Pendulum Graph Trap or the Pendulum Graph Spell, the one that constantly adds cards to their hand. One of the things that I really like about Unending Nightmare, I think it's actually main deck worthy simply because there are so many field spells in our meta. Like the field spell is just, or the meta is just kind of littered with all of these field spells, and even if you're not playing against the Pendulum Magician matchup, you can still use this kind of as an MST against Union Hangar or against Spiral Resort, even something like Trickstar Light Stage. So almost every deck in the meta is going to give you an opportunity to get a little bit of value out of this card, and that's what I definitely like. The only thing you kind of have to watch out for this is there are a couple of the Magician Scales that you don't want to pop because they may have effects that benefit your opponent. For instance, Purple Poison is a card that I would assume you probably never want to pop with this unless you have a way of dealing with Purple Poison's effect, because Purple Poison Magician will blow this card up in response. But the good thing is your opponent has to have 2 Pendulum Scales to Pendulum Summon, so whatever isn't the Purple Poison, you can just blow that card up. The second card I want to talk about is Heavy Dust Storm. This is a card that I like a great deal as just really good generic spell and trap removal, but I think it's especially strong in any Pendulum matchup, mainly because it can get rid of a fully completed Pendulum Scale. So if you crack your opponent's Pendulum Scales, you're obviously going +1 in that category. It's also really good in kind of these set 5 decks, these decks that don't have a lot of discard fodder, so they can't play Twin Twister as effectively as maybe they like. Altergeist or Paleozoic Frogs, this basically becomes your Twin Twister. And if you're going to directly compare it to Unending Nightmare and you're thinking this card doesn't stack up, Unending is always going to be better, you might actually be surprised. For starters, I don't know about you guys, but when I play Unending Nightmare, it has a tendency of getting Ghost Ogre, which is really unfortunate because then I just lose 1,000 life points for pretty much no gain. And even though I blew up one of my opponent's spells and traps, getting 1 isn't really that big of a deal. Getting 2 with this card means that they might not be able to Pendulum Summon, and I get to save my life points because this card doesn't have any cost attached to it. Another thing about Heavy Dust Storm is it can actually get rid of face down cards. So even if your opponent does search the Pendulum Trap or they search the Pendulum Spell, maybe they don't activate it immediately because they're afraid of your back row, you can actually just punish them and you can get rid of their back row cards. So maybe they don't have enough Pendulum skills to actually complete the Pendulum Summon, but they do have maybe some strikes or some other cards that you don't want to deal with. You can go after those as well. Another cool thing is it's a lot harder to actually punish because considering you won't be able to see this this card coming if you're a Pendulum player, a lot more often than not your opponent is going to throw down their best Pendulum cards in the zones immediately, and they're not going to expect this card, so it's going to kind of hit them like a wrecking ball. They're going to throw down their their copies of Wisdom Eye. They're going to throw down whatever magicians that they want to resolve early. You can punish those cards. They won't be able to really do much about it. And the last thing is this also can not really be punished by Purple Poison. So if your opponent uses Purple Poison, you can just feel free to blow it up, and if you don't have any other face-up cards on the field, you still get 2 cards for 1, and you really don't have to worry about any of your cards getting blown up, where Unending Nightmare will almost always get blown up by Purple Poison Magician. So next category is actually the hand traps. A lot of people might expect me to immediately start talking about Ash Blossom. As good as Ash Blossom is as one of the best hand traps in the game, I don't think that she's the best hand trap for this matchup particularly. I think that there are actually a couple of hand traps that are significantly better. Don't get me wrong, if your opponent throws out a Desires, it's always nice to have a hand trap, and Pendulum Magicians can run that card. But in general, if your opponent throws out the normal summon that I think they always want, which is Joker, and you happen to Ash Blossom it, especially if they're going second, they still have like 5 cards in their hand. So even if they commit 2 to the scales, they can still have 3 cards to Pendulum Summon, and they can do a lot with those 3 cards. Your opponent can go into Electromite, they can do whatever they want, and at that point, they've kind of broken out of your control. Drolan Lockbird is a card that I really like in this matchup, and if you use it against a Joker search, your opponent does get the plus, but what can they really do with that plus other than Pendulum Summon or go completely defensive with number 41? If you really look at the Pendulum Magician deck and what makes it so strong, I would argue that a lot of its consistency comes from its search ability and the fact that they can kind of get to whatever card they need at any given time. It's very similar to something like Necros, but if you happen to draw the Joker, or if you draw them early enough in their turn, so much of their deck, maybe even like a third of their deck, just kind of becomes dead cards or cards that don't have much value. Time Star Magician, they can't search off that. Wavering Eyes, another card that searches that's not useful at that point. Duelist Alliance, Double Iris, Pendulum Call, their Astrograph Sorcerer, I mean, yeah, sure, they can still summon it, but they can't search off of it. So a lot of their deck is, you know, kind of just allotted to searching, and none of those cards are going to be legitimate threats if they can't actually search cards. So a draw is actually a -1, but if you can just kill them because maybe they didn't get the opportunity to search out their Pendulum Graph trap card, that's perfectly fine taking that neg. Or if you know that you can play defense strong enough, if you can set your board up, you can just limit them to not really doing anything or force them into going to number 41. Maybe you can start trying to outgrind them. I think the neg is well worth it, especially considering if you don't, a lot of times they just make those uncrackable boards and they get everything that they want to. Next up is Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, and this might be a little surprising, but I like this card again a little more than Ash Blossom. As I just said, if you Ash Blossom your opponent early and they're able to make Electromite, they can still kind of do everything that they wanted to do. However, Ghost Ogre is pretty much a direct counter to Electromite, and we all know that Electromite is the play starter for that archetype. It digs Astrograph Sorcerer right out of their deck, and then not only did they get to pop a card, but they get to summon that dude, they get to draw a card, they get to search a card that they just popped. This is pretty much all stopped by having a copy of Ghost Ogre. I have not seen one person yet summon Electromite and not activate his ability to dump a card in their extra deck. As soon as they do that, you pop their Electromite. It's really cool because if you do blow up the Electromite, even if they have Astrograph Sorcerer in their hand, sure, they can summon it, but they don't get to search anything because he's not a Pendulum card. So you already have that working for you. Blowing up the Electromite means that they kind of have to go back to square zero. It also means that their extra zones, like their extra monster zones, aren't open. So even if they're going to summon something, it has to be in that one extra monster zone. So this is a card that doesn't stop that much of the deck, but it stops the most important thing that the deck is going to do. It can also be used against the scale cards like Wisdom Eye, being able to pop those, knowing that they have to, spells and traps have to stay face up to actually fully resolve. Speaking of cards that have to stay face up to resolve, this can actually blow up both of the Pendulum Graph cards as well. So this card is overall really good, and again, it stops their most important play, which is Electromite. If you can stop that, you can generally keep the Pendulum Magician deck in check. And finally, to our last category, which are Floodgates. I felt it very appropriate to leave these for last because even though they have the highest upside, they actually in fact punish both players, and sometimes they can limit some of the things that your deck actually wants to do. You guys know the basic ideology behind Floodgates, though, is your opponent is going to be hurt a hell of a lot more by these cards than you are. I think you guys know some of the cards that I'm going to talk about. The obligatory Anti-Spell Fragrance. This is a card that's been used against Pendulum archetypes since the inception of the Pendulum mechanic. It obviously says your opponent can never really put cards in their Pendulum skills because the cards can't be set face down. However, I would warn you, their Pendulum effect monsters can still activate. So your opponent could still set something like a purple poison on the field. If you recklessly attack it, you blow it up, they could end up blowing up your Anti-Spell Fragrance. So this card is not necessarily the be-all end-all because they can still do a lot of things under that, but stopping their ability to Pendulum Summon in general can sometimes be better than stopping the monsters that they actually want to put on the board or stopping the Pendulum skills when they're actually in those zones. So Anti-Spell Fragrance is obviously a really solid option. The last floodgate I want to talk about is Mistake. I like Mistake a lot because it's basically just Droll and Lockbird built into a continuous trap card, and it's actually really good because it can stop the Joker search as well, so you can slow your opponent there. And if you play a deck that really doesn't need to search all that much, or your deck can kind of pop off, you can do all your searching turn one, then you don't need to use it as much, then this is kind of a card that can make a big difference. We already talked about how Duelist Alliance, Double Iris Magician, Pendulum Call, Wavering Eye, so many of their cards in their deck are kind of cards that search other cards. Astrograph Sorcerer, I didn't even mention Perform a Power Pendulum Sorcerer, which sometimes I see them play. All of those cards are shut down. Now with that said, they can still Pendulum Summon, and they can still, you know, make stuff in their extra deck. So I wouldn't say that Mistake alone beats them. I think Mistake is a card that you generally have to back up with like a Solemn. Just make sure that if they go for that Tornado Dragon, you can Solemn that, and a lot of times you'll just win because they'll be drawing so many cards that are dead, or cards like Astrograph Magician where it's kind of like taking the venom out of the snake. They don't really have that much they can really do with that card other than, I guess, just try to beat you down with a 2500 vanilla monster at that point. So you guys let me know what you thought of this list. If there were other cards that are really good against Pendulum Magicians, go ahead and leave that in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already. Turn on that notification bell for daily videos.